Hello. Welcome back to the 19th episode of Peter York's Culture Wars House Party. I'm Peter York, and my podcast is about culture wars, disinformation and misinformation, stories. It's about the way modern politics is so often played out with symbols and scapegoats, with dramatic and emotive subjects instead of the real issues. It's about small things blown up to upset and distract people, made-up causes and astroturf organisations, meaning grassroots, quotes, organisations that are actually invented by PRs and lobbyists. And it's named after the American fake grass brand. I'll be talking to the players and the commentators in these culture wars and getting them to explain what they think is really happening and not happening because it's made up. And then, if we can, we'll ask some really vital questions, a bit of lifestyle and shopping. Now, Paul Krugman is a tremendously important American economist. He's got all the right labels and connections and provenance, so even English people would know what it was. He's a distinguished professor of economics at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He was a hugely admired columnist for the New York Times from 2000 until last year. He's been a prof at MIT and at Princeton. Oh, and he's got a Nobel Prize too, from 2008, when he was the sole winner of the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. He's written a lot of very learned books and articles, most of which are, frankly, seriously above my head. But he's made himself accessible too. Substack and YouTube and the usual places, writing about politics and the point where politics meets economics in a very readable way, with very clear views which have built an influential relationship with a general audience. He left the New York Times at the back end of last year because, well, let him explain that. Paul Krugman, hello.
Hi there.
Welcome to our house party. Little British people mainly experience contemporary American politics through Donald Trump, and particularly his foreign policies from Ukraine and Gaza to dizzying tariff announcements, daily tariff announcements. However, wannabe geeks, Brits like me, find themselves utterly jaws on the floor about his domestic policies and the fact that middle-aged, respectable, establishment academics like Jason Stanley and Timothy Snyder say that the current Trump government is now fascist. I even heard Kamala Harris, who doesn't strike me as, I think Trump's word is a lunatic communist. She doesn't strike me as a lunatic communist. She said the same in London last week at a sort of do for her book, which I went to. So, how bad is it really in America? Or am I the victim of lefty propaganda?
Oh, no. I mean, there is a slight paradox. If you're someone like me who is affluent and not insecure in my job and all of that, and daily life, and white, by the way, daily life is still very, very pleasant. I'm doing this from New York City, and this is in many ways New York City is, if you can afford a place to live, is probably the most livable it has ever been. But out there, we have, first of all, we clearly have a government that does not accept the legitimacy of opposition. So this is just a daily thing. Trump and his party routinely accuse everybody who offers the slightest objection of being, a traitor. I personally am a deranged bum, according to the president. But so that's not what we thought was the American tradition. He just disregards the law if he doesn't like it. And my God, masked government agents grabbing people off the street, pulling parents away from their children, zip tying people face down on the ground. That is all happening now. And it's not so minor that most people don't see it. Everyone is aware that it's happening, and particularly I have Latino friends who are not your average They tend to be highly educated. They tend to be very, very much the sort of people you'd expect to be mainstreamed in our famously open society. They travel around with passport cards so that they can prove that they're citizens, although they're not sure that even that will work.
That's part of what's very frightening from what we read. The troops into democratic cities is very frightening for what we read. And the attack on academics sounds very frightening. So, for instance, I know a couple of Brits who teach in American universities, and they say that the world is very frightening for them. So, for instance, they come back, they have their children at school in the UK, they come back, they're worried lest they aren't let back in, They're very worried that they might have said 6 years ago, Donald Trump is not 100% nice in all respects, or something inflammatory like that.
Oh, I know UK and European-born academics, some of them U.S. citizens, some of them not, but all of them actually now travel when they go back and forth. They travel with burner phones, because if your mobile contains texts that are critical of Trump, you probably won't be thrown into an ICE prison, but you might be. And it's happening enough that it's actually affecting people's decisions. A significant number of prominent economists have already left the U.S., the people I know, and others have made backup plans to decamp. So we're not talking about things that are remote and distant. We're talking about an actual environment of fear and intimidation, with nobody knowing how far it goes. But it's got all the ingredients of an authoritarian takeover. It looks like Hungary or Putin's Russia in the 90s. So, yeah, it's scary.
What is Trump actually any good at?
Well, he's very good at speaking to, what can I say? He's a showman. I mean, he was never actually a very good businessman, but he was a very good, the character he played on TV was a great businessman. One of the best articles I ever read about Trump, which was during his first term, was Adam Serwer's The Cruelty is the Point, which is that there's a segment of the population that actually enjoys the idea of seeing marginalized groups, or just generally people they don't like, which can include, intellectuals, terrorized, hurt, and Trump channels that. So there are definitely people for whom he is a very special figure. He is doing what they always wanted to do, so he appeals to them.
So it's more than just owning the libs, it's everyday sadism.
Yeah, it's not just rhetorical owning. People I hang out with see videos and images of masked agents throwing women to the floor and zip tying them and react with horror, but there is a segment of the population who looks at it and feels a sense of satisfaction.
How big and how consistent a segment do you think that is?
Probably about 30%.
Yeah.
And by the way, it's not clear that America is really that different. There's probably that 25 to 30% everywhere. They exist. They're reform supporters in Britain. They're AfD supporters in Germany. They're whatever the National Front is calling itself now in France. So what is unique is that in the U.S. system, a combination of the weirdness of our electoral process and a bunch of institutional factors and a public anger over inflation actually put these people in power.
And the links and the parallels with the hard right across Europe and reform, which of course is very careful about who it aligns itself with, pretty careful not saying our lovely best friends in France and the AfD and all that stuff. And they're pretty careful not to align themselves with Tommy. You know about Tommy Robinson?
Yeah.
Who is very, very fascinating. Reform have been careful not to take Tommy Robinson into their particular big tent. Now, what is he not so good at? As you said, he is a creation of the TV, a creation, almost a fictional creation of the TV. As a politician, as a president, as a CEO, what is he not so good at?
Well, he's actually a terrible manager. The character he played on TV, the tough, you're fired manager, he does like to fire people. He likes to stiff people and not pay them, but to actually run things, he's, run many enterprises into the ground. And just in general, a movement that is as hardline as his is anyone who's actually competent is suspect.
Yeah.
Anyone who actually knows what they're doing might, first of all, have some independence because there's other demand for their services. They might actually be tempted to take a stand on conscience. So Trump has surrounded himself with people who really cannot do their official jobs. They can be apparatchiks, they can do their political job, but they can't actually run things, which is actually becoming apparent much faster than people expected this time around. He's not a Mussolini who made the trains run on time. He's a bumbler who right now the airplanes aren't taking off on time. He's a very good opposition politician, but a really terrible incumbent, which is kind of where the hope lies.
But does his opportunity lie in the fact that the Democrats were in some ways asleep at the wheel? And I'm not just thinking of the particular Biden thing, but in general, that the Democrat organization had become somewhat asleep at the wheel, had not noticed what had happened in the world.
Well, I would have said not even the Democratic establishment, but the establishment in general was just in denial about where we were going. There was endless soul searching among Democrats. How did we lose in 2024? And are we too out of touch? And do we need to get less woke? And then, but many of us had pointed out that basically every incumbent government in the world that had an election last year lost it because of anger over inflation, which was mostly nobody's fault. And just a couple of days before this interview, we had some important off-year elections in the United States, and they were an absolute blowout for the Democrats. So I don't think that's really a problem specifically, but people did not take precautions. They continue, and still to some extent, they still do, try to deal with the current government in the United States as if it was a normal political organization, as if it was, really believed in the norms. There are still some people out there who just don't get it. And that's a lot of the establishment, not just, we can talk about this, but I think that the partially, a little bit personal, but the anti-Semitism discourse is the kind of blindness to where the real threats lie is still there. The Anti-Defamation League, which is supposed to defend Jews, is busy going on how they're going to keep a close eye on the new mayor of New York, who is a lefty Muslim, but not at all scary. But they're going to keep an eye on him for anti-Semitism when actual Nazis are taking over large parts of the Republican institutional structure. So just the unwillingness to see what it is that we're facing, I think that's the big issue.
It is interesting and a bit jaw-dropping to watch how right-wingers in America, and to some extent in this country, have weaponized the fight against anti-Semitism. And so they've seen it that academics, universities are terrible strongholds of anti-Semitism because they allow Palestinian protests. And the same has happened here. Now, I seem to remember Trump saying in the face of a sort of Ku Klux Klan march, where people were shouting, "Jews shall not replace us," meaning presumably George Soros and all that theory. And he said there were good people on both sides.
Yeah, no, that happens to be one particular issue where everything historical says, look, yeah, there's anti-Semitism that crops up among extremists of all brands, but from the right is far more dangerous. That has always been true historically, and it's right out there in front. And yet, well, if you want, they also managed to weaponize charges of pedophilia against the left, and now they're desperately trying to prevent the release of the Epstein files, which we're pretty sure we know who's in them. But this is all about a combination of a sort of captive media structure and the timidity, the unwillingness to face up to realities on the part of a lot of institutions.
How does this parallel between the wars, this extraordinary institutional cave-in, bending the knee at every point, looks a bit like Putin and the oligarchs, where he said, keep yourselves out of domestic politics and you can take whatever you want.
Yeah, well, it's definitely, I mean, the most immediate parallel, at least we thought, was Hungary, where you had this democratically elected government, which then proceeded to dismantle democracy from inside. And I happen to have been, because of friends and colleagues, have been particularly following Orban from way back, so immediately recognized that. And by the way, they acknowledge the Republicans love Orban. They love Hungary. The Putin parallel is actually looking stronger by the day, because that was a much more blatant, more extreme thing, and the role of the oligarchs was such a big part of it. The funny thing about it is that, not funny, but Trump and the people around him, I think that a lot of it is the people around him, they're trying to run that on fast forward. They're trying to run a Putin-esque takeover of the United States, which took years for Putin to do, and they're trying to do it in months. And there are a lot of reasons to think that they may fail, that they're not actually going to pull this off. There is some hope here, but definitely, if you don't think that Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg are playing roles comparable to that of the oligarchs in Russia in the 90s, then you are completely blind to stuff that we all remember, not ancient history.
Does Trump have an economic policy?
That's an interesting question. I mean, he has an obsession. He loves tariffs, which is not, there's not a large base for that. That's really just a personal obsession of his. Beyond that, if you look for any kind of coherence in what he's doing, he hates wind turbines and because they spoil the view from his golf course. That's what he thinks. He basically dislikes doing anything to help people in distress. But is there any kind of coherent policy? No. And it's always kind of funny, when people say, well, let us try to understand the strategizing behind the tariffs or the strategizing behind his energy policy. And I always ask, who do you think is doing this strategizing? Point me to anybody in his administration who actually knows what they're doing, has any competence, even for evil purposes on these domains.
Well, some people's answer is it's all down there in the book, and it came out a couple of years ago from the Heritage Foundation, and that will tell him every action that he should take.
Oh, yeah. Project 2025 from Heritage Foundation is very detailed. And it's a very well thought out plan for how to subvert the functioning of democracy. The details about how to corrupt the institutions of government are really there. In terms of actual policies for running the country, not so good. It's actually pretty poorly thought out. And, Heritage Foundation, that's a whole story. I'll probably be writing about that soon. People have this image that the Heritage Foundation is or was a serious think tank with very strong right-wing politics that maybe has gone off the rails recently. But the fact of the matter is they've been utterly incapable of actually thinking for a long time, as long as I've been following them. So this is more gut feelings and instincts than it is an actual policy. And if we want to get into it, I think this is one important difference between one of the hopeful signs, if you like, between Trump and the autocrats he's trying to emulate, is that they were in a position to actually, for a while, make many people's lives better. And Trump is not. And they were popular for a while, and Trump has instantly become extremely unpopular. In that respect, we are not following a Putin or an Orban track.
It would be interesting to compare the polling about Trump in America, in Europe, and in the UK. People in the UK are against Trump, not because what they understand about his domestic policies, because for the most part they don't, but they understand what he looks like and what he sounds like and his extraordinary use of superlatives about himself, which don't go down very well in Great Britain. I did the most wonderfulest thing that's ever been done in history, and then I did the next most wonderful thing, and I solved 7 wars in the blinking of an eye and that sort of thing. People don't like that terribly much.
Well, I sometimes wonder about what's happened to my own country's culture, because it used to be that kind of boastfulness was, a kiss of death for you politically. It was just in general. You were supposed to be the strong, silent type. You were supposed to be Gary Cooper, or, whatever. You were supposed to be modest, and it was unmanly to puff yourself up like that. And there's still obviously many people who feel that way, but it's clearly not unacceptable in the way it used to be. And I don't know where we lost that. I'm not one of those people who's nostalgic for past culture in many respects, but that I thought that a certain amount of modesty, Republican and with a small r, Republican virtue and restraint was expected from politicians, and just in general was expected to be a good person. You were supposed to not brag about yourself. But obviously that was not a huge liability for Trump last year. I think what's happening now is that people are looking at the policies, are looking at, hey, he said grocery prices would come way down, and they're actually up. And people I know have been arrested by immigration enforcement. That is what's actually driving the collapse of his popularity here.
So if he hasn't got a real thought-through policy, and if Heritage 2025 is, as I read it, and I was surprised, I was reading the summary, not the whole thing. It's very long. I was astonished to find that it was more Billy Graham than think tank, and I hadn't expected that. It was distinctly ideological with lashings of religion too.
Yeah, but that's, again, the Heritage has cosplayed as a think tank the same way, if you like, that Trump cosplayed as an effective manager on TV. If they ever were a place where you did serious thinking, that was gone by the Obama years. So, yeah, there's a scandal developing as it turns out that there's actually a lot of anti-Semitism at Heritage, which comes as absolutely zero surprise if you have any sense of history here. But there really isn't an agenda. If I can say something, maybe hijack the direction here for just a minute. What happened in previous, in the role models for what Trump is trying to do, were that the authoritarians took power in countries that were really in trouble and were able, mostly through luck, but also perhaps just because their very heterodoxy was a good thing under the circumstances, were able to deliver. So Orban took over a Hungary that was being ravaged by austerity and was able to relax that a bit. And so Hungary starts to recover. Putin took over a Russia that was in chaos after a financial crisis and was able to preside over a recovery just by sort of presiding over the end of that crisis. And Hitler didn't believe in the economic orthodoxy of the day. And as it happened, the economic orthodoxy of 1933 was deeply destructive. So by rejecting the gold standard and all of that, he actually was able to preside over an economic miracle, as people said at the time. Trump has none of those things. America was in, people were mad because of prices were high, but America was in pretty good shape when Trump took office. And he has zero plan, zero ideology, except for this obsession with tariffs. So he is not actually able to surf a wave of economic recovery. And I'm mixing metaphors horribly, but not able to lock in autocracy while surfing the waves. But so that doesn't mean he won't succeed, but it is certainly a very different story.
So if we discount for the moment the Heritage Foundation as a great template, by the way, the extent to which those kinds of, quote, think tanks derive from London. It is a deeply fascinating story. If you go back to Sir Anthony Fisher and the IEA in 1955 and what he did, and then him meeting the Koch brothers and starting that, universal system of think tankery across the globe. One little British person did this.
That makes sense. I didn't know that story. But yeah, I mean, certainly the big money, the America's oligarchs played the long game, not just try to tilt individual elections, but try to create the intellectual climate for the kinds of things they wanted. And what is interesting is that my impression is much more than in Britain. We do have a sort of center-left think tank universe, where on the center-left, they actually are think tanks, and they provide a large reserve of people who actually understand policy for Democratic politicians. So that's a very different story. But yeah, I'm not at all surprised to find that there's much more globalism on the right than you think. It's much more of a global network.
Oh, for sure. There's a British political writer called Matt D'Ancona, who now works on what was the New European is the New World. And he wrote a brilliant piece for Tortoise just before the lockdown called Bannon's Britain, about the way that right-wing politics in Britain were part of a networked international group, and that Parliament was just flummery, pageantry in front of it, that serious right-wing politicians in the UK were Bannon's people. Because back, he was more important then than he is now, I guess. But that leaves us with a third group of people who might or might not be to blame. What about Trump's cabinet? It looks from here to be entirely made up of nut jobs.
Yes, appearances are not deceiving. These are, no, this is an extraordinary group of people. I mean that in the worst way. Look, Secretary of Defense, which is rather a crucial thing in the world's greatest military power with nuclear weapons, is obviously is a former Fox News host and clearly doesn't know a thing about his job, doesn't understand anything. And, he summoned all of our top military officers from around the world to give them a lecture on warrior ethos and on the importance of being physically fit. Go down the list, and, even the person who was supposed to be the adult in the room, which is our Treasury Secretary, effectively Chancellor of the Exchequer, is turning out to be really just as bad. And this, by the way, this cluelessness, we're having these trade wars, and he said, well, I'm a soybean farmer myself, meaning that he, who's a very wealthy man, that he owns a bunch of land in the agricultural districts, and that, again, that's the kind of thing that would, in a previous America, have just gotten you laughed out of public life. But somehow or other, people get away with it now.
Well, and then there is the curious Kennedy.
Oh, my God. I have to say, I did not see that coming. I thought that he was such an obvious flake. When Silicon Valley types temporarily started rallying around him as a presidential candidate, my thought was, boy, they are idiots because he's an idiot. But there's something about the being bombastically incompetent is sort of a baseline qualification for being in the Trump administration. And Trump, maybe correctly, he likes that kind of thing in people. And he may have thought that RFK Jr. can peel off a few voters who like his medical nonsense.
Yeah, and taking potions of bleach to deal with COVID and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, you would have thought that there was another substratum of people who knew how to do things while the show went on. But is there a group of people who know how to do things?
No, I mean, and this is one, at least in places where I actually know what the topic and the people, which is largely economic policy, but as everyone tells me it's the same elsewhere. There basically is no room, not just in Trump and MAGA, but in the modern American right. There is no room. There is no room for technocrats. There is no room for people who just do the math, understand the issues, because it's, again, there's a loyalty test. and being technically competent is basically disqualifying. So you can really see that. I don't want to make this all about Heritage, but Heritage has for decades now had a sequence of chief economists who are famously incapable of getting a number right. And increasingly now also turn out that Trump tried to get the current Heritage chief economist, put him in charge of labor statistics in the United States, and might have succeeded, even though he's clearly doesn't know a damn thing about the subject, except that it turns out that he's also a crazy QAnon type with a social media history full of crude anti-female slurs. And, so there is nobody there. Such people have been driven out, and not recently either. They've been gone for a decade or more.
But how long can things last in that situation?
Well, this is the slightly sad thing. If you're a kind of policy-oriented nerd like me, you want to believe that it's really, really important to have people who know what they're doing. And on average and over the long term, yes, it is, but time and chance happeneth to us all. You can have a really very good team of people, which Biden did, and just get sideswiped by the economic after effects of a pandemic. Or you can have really bad people, which Trump did. There were some actual adults in the first Trump administration, which did help. But also, he just happened to be there at a time when things were going right for the world economy and the U.S. economy. By the way, this applies to other people, too. I mean, we had the best economy that anyone can remember took place under Bill Clinton. And I'd like to say that was because Clinton hired good people, which he did. But mostly he was just in the right place at the right time for when the U.S. economy was experiencing a burst of productivity growth and low inflation.
Because I associate Clinton with a substructure of clever, young meritocrats or relative meritocrats. And to some extent, I associate Obama with that, because people in his own image.
Yes, but that was also true of Biden. And and Biden was just unlucky. And being unlucky can trump any amount of well-thought-out policy.
And people get old and they get ill, and then they don't want to talk about it. And nobody else wants to talk about it either. But clearly, that period was extended hopelessly long, wasn't it?
Well, yeah. But honestly, political analysts that I talk to, political scientists, say we make too much of the personalities here. It probably wouldn't have mattered. I mean, maybe if Biden had stepped down and the Democrats maybe either given Harris time to establish herself as an independent figure, or the Democrats had held a primary and selected someone else, maybe they could have pulled it out last year. But, no other Democratic incumbent government did. So the times were just wrong. And by the way, winning every election against the crazies is not a viable strategy for maintaining a democracy. The real problem is, how do we end up restoring sanity to the opposition? Reporters, political journalists obsess about personalities and stories and all of that, because that's their business, and that also gets readers. And discussing results of statistical analyses that show that inflation, and even if it's demonstrably mostly not just the fault of the incumbents, that inflation is deadly for office holders, that doesn't lend itself to scoops. It doesn't make good TV. So the fundamentals are really mostly what's going on here.
And the fundamentals are, Trump is now, as you pointed out, polling really badly, and some of his policies must, by definition, be hitting his people. So apart from sadism, which I think is a very important characteristic, apart from sadism, what is the hold he has over core MAGAs? They can't all be utterly blind to their economic self-interests, or can they?
Well, not utterly, but it takes a lot. And it's also very easy to blame someone else. So we had, getting really parochial, but one of the really important races that we just had was for governor of New Jersey. And that was a campaign that was fought largely over rising electricity prices, which everyone sees. But then the question is, who do you blame? And to a large extent, the answer is nobody. To a large extent, the answer is actually it's the AI boom and the data centers and all that. But the two candidates for governor were going at each other with each claiming that the other's party was to blame. The Democrat basically won that argument. And the really important thing to understand is that, and this isn't even a condemnation, most people have no idea about policy and its impacts. Why should they? People have children to raise and jobs to do and lives to live, and it's only wonks like me who obsess about these things. So they can be sold narratives. It's a big mistake to lie to them about how they're doing. And I think this is one of Trump's big mistakes now, is he's going around telling people things are great and prices are falling, and that everybody can see with their own eyes is not happening. But if things are bad, who to blame? From the Trump people, it's all, electricity prices are up in New Jersey because of this idiotic fixation on renewable energy, which happens to be, as it turns out, there's basically no renewable energy in New Jersey. And the NIMBYs have blocked the wind farms, and it's not exactly the sunniest state in America. So it's basically hasn't happened at all there. But that doesn't mean that people can't be convinced that it has.
Yeah, very, very much so. Do the Democrats have an answer in the making? Do you see green shoots? Mr. Mamdani, is he a green shoot? Are the other wins green shoots?
Oh, Mamdani he's just sweet generous. I mean, it's fine. It would have been so depressing if a corrupt old sexual predator had won that election. But New York is just totally unlike the rest of America. Neither bad nor good, just different. A population density that is just, there's nothing like it anywhere else in America. Ethnic diversity that is pretty much unmatched except in Los Angeles. So, what happened here is a very poor clue, except that Mamdani did run talking about affordability, which is what everybody did. I think the results in the other states, especially actually New Jersey, are more indicative, and they do show it's not clear that they even need to do dramatically different things. The groups that swung to Trump last year that were a surprise and were a shock there were a lot of non-white working class voters who voted for Trump, believing his promises that he could bring prices down, kind of remembering that things were pretty good before the pandemic. They have learned better already. And it looks like my friend G. Elliott Morris, who does these quantitative voting analysis, says that the groups that swung to Trump last year, that were his margin of victory in the recent elections, they swung to the Democrats by 25 points. If you look at people who say the economy is their biggest concern, they swung to the Democrats by 90 points. So I think in a lot of ways, the whole thing that brought Trump to power last year is over. Democrats just need to continue to sound tough and talk about ordinary things, and which they mostly do anyway. The only real question now is, but will we actually really have anything like fair elections?
That's what, call me paranoid, but that's what plays in my mind. The long haul fixing of the Supreme Court, the absolute emphasis on doing funny things to the electoral system, plus for us, the ununderstandability of the national vote and then the electoral colleges, which we don't understand at all, which seem a very biased influence on the total result, because they seem to be, you have as much influence if you're, Alabama as if you're California, sort of thing. That we don't understand, but we think is a fix. So do you think they're going to be fair elections?
Well, they will be tilted in the way that they always are by the Electoral College. And at this point, let's put it this way, Wyoming and the two Dakotas combined have about the same population as Brooklyn. Combined, they have 6 senators. Brooklyn has to share 2 senators with the rest of New York State. So that's a wildly off system. And cultural things, maybe talk about that for a second in a minute. The deep hostility of a lot of rural America to urban America is a factor. But that in itself, that's the reason why it's still an uphill climb for Democrats to take the Senate next year. But in anything like a fair election, otherwise, they will take the House. And but no, what we're worried about is much more. I mean, what I'm worried about is much more acute than that. And if you're not being remotely paranoid enough, I think. But I'm worried about ICE raids on polling stations on election day. I'm worried about Democratic candidates being arrested on trumped-up charges, and so possibly even vigilante mobs. Everything is on the table as a possibility. And if you say, well, they wouldn't do that, that's been a good way to be wrong every time for years now. I have to say that the fact that the consolidation of power is, I think, not going according to plan. There's a lot more resistance than they expected. There's a lot more backlash. But still, we don't know what happens.
Do we know the rest of the West? Do we know enough about domestic American problems, like you're entertaining as a real possibility that there will be major interference of a pretty crass kind at polling stations? Do you think there be any use in you telling the rest of the world, you collectively, clever people in America, telling the world what's going on, or are you shy of doing that?
Oh, I don't have a problem with telling people that. Of course, I'm writing my Substack, and a fair number of my readers, I believe, are international. But the priority for someone like me is what can we do to save ourselves? And that's going to have to be done here. Nobody is going to intervene from abroad. It doesn't really matter whether the British public or the German public understands the U.S. situation. And stern expressions of concern from abroad
could make it worse.
We're Americans. We don't actually really believe that you exist, right? I mean, it's so that doesn't matter.
I understand that completely. So the politics of what I call the tech Pluto right, people who are actively political in the tech plutocracy, as opposed to people who are amoral and play it as it lays. So I would call the tech Pluto right Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, and many more besides, most of whose names I don't know. Recently, those people have taken a great interest in us, our little UK. For example, you will have read about the Elon and Tommy Robinson demo in London, a huge demo led by Tommy Robinson, who is very experienced with American plutocracy, let's say. People don't know that because he's a former sort of football hooligan, etc., right-wing march type person. But he knows right-wing America very well and has spent a lot of time with it and knew people like Alex Jones and Milo Yiannopoulos and all that stuff. But the combination of this person, who seems like a, medium-scale local phenomenon, plus Elon Musk on an enormous screen in Trafalgar Square, if we say that the whole affair was basically organised for America, why are they bothering with that?
Well, can I say, first of all, it's an opportunity for a takeover, and relative to buying the United States, buying Britain is cheap.
It's very cheap.
If we're talking about these tech bro oligarch types, you have to have some sense of the scale of their wealth. I actually did a back of the envelope. Elon Musk famously believes all kinds of things that aren't true. He picks up on conspiracy theories that float across his feed on Twitter and all that. And he could very easily be the best informed person on the planet. So the back of the envelope calculation I did was I figured out that he could personally maintain just a personal intelligence service on roughly the same scale as MI5. Right. So relative to the wealth that these people have, I mean, Musk just got a $1 trillion paycheck approved. At some level, they may be saying, well, maybe running into a few problems here with our conquest of America. Maybe that'll take longer than we thought. But hey, let's conquer Britain, just sort of as a side venture.
Almost unknown writer came out with a seriously interesting book, unknown because he doesn't spend his time writing. He's an entrepreneur and a philanthropist and so on. And he wrote a book which came out last year and was almost universally praised, called Vassal State. He's highly numerate, and he has shown that roughly America owns 30% of Britain, and that much of what it owns is what he calls bridges, very dynamic, important bits of the economy. And he also showed that British politicians, including a pair of former chancellors, didn't really understand the extent of the ownership or the nature of the ownership or the different types of investments that were involved. Many of them quite different from, say, setting up a Nissan car factory. It's outright purchase of existing assets. And that means, I asked him, does that give America more political power over us? And he said, yes.
Well, first of all, capital is very globalized. When people talk about cutting corporate tax rates in America, one important point is that about 40% of U.S. equities are actually owned by foreigners. So those benefits don't necessarily flow through even to America's own plutocrats. They flow through to plutocrats all around the world. And so it's not the idea that American interests should own a large part of Britain. That's not at all surprising. In a way, I'm surprised that the number isn't even higher. And most foreign direct investment, which is investment that brings control, is not building new factories. Most of it is acquiring existing companies. In a way, we were talking earlier about how the hard right is an international movement, and authoritarian plutocracy is an international movement too. But is that America? Is it, or is it some people based in America? Right? That's a big difference. I mean, it is true that a U.S. government, any U.S. government, has a lot of coercive power. By leaning on American companies, which then in turn have interests abroad, that's one of the routes. But there's all of these things: control of the financial system, control to a large extent of the global internet. Friends of mine, Farrell and Newman, wrote a book about weaponized interdependence, which was saying the United States has far more ability to put the screws on other countries than most people realize, but it turns out that so do the Chinese in their own way. So it's if you're a medium-sized country like Britain, it takes a lot of determination to stand up to pressure from the big guys.
And it is fascinating, but a bit horrifying for quite a lot of Brits to see Keir Starmer in the Oval Office presenting Trump with a letter from our king. We know they have to do it. We know they're thinking about a trade deal, all that stuff. But if you knew the political and cultural roots of the current Labour cabinet, which is the first British cabinet to be entirely staffed by people who were educated in state schools as opposed to public schools. It's quite an important and an extraordinary distinction. But there they are. We've got David Lammy making nice with J.D. Vance, as if they were the greatest friends in the universe.
Well, on the one hand, we do know that flattering Trump, boosting his ego, does get you something, and it's cheap. It's not substantive. policy and it's not expensive. So on one level, that makes sense for countries to do. On the other hand, I'm not sure that in terms of domestic politics, that it's actually a good idea. And one of the things that has been interesting is to watch Canada, which is far more exposed to American whims than anyone else except Mexico. Canada actually taking a stiffer stance of opposition to Trump than you are. But part of it is that the Canadian public loathes Trump, loathes what's happening in America. The Liberal Party in Canada was headed for a crushing defeat, and then Trump stepped in, and Mark Carney is prime minister. And Carney, I have no idea. I mean, I actually know him, and he's a very mild-mannered, technocratic guy, and probably in a different environment, he would probably be saying, let's buy off Trump with some flattery. But he knows that his own country won't stand for it. So I will have to wonder whether Starmer is actually taking the pulse correctly. But I don't know British politics, but I would think that looking obsequious to Trump, that's a really bad political move anywhere on earth.
That's how it looks from where I am. And I am, of course, in the heart of metropolitan liberal elite London. And of course, lots of us think we know America because we know New York and maybe a bit of Washington and have been to, had fun in California. We don't know. It's been powerfully brought home to me over the last 10 years that I don't know the quote-unquote real America, but how real is it? I've never been to any of those places that begin with A.
Yeah. There is no real America. There are just a bunch of Americas, as there are in Britain as well. There are just London is not unreal. It's just very different from the north. But it is true that what foreigners see is not a representative sample. It's also true, by the way, that it's not just that foreigners and New Yorkers are ignorant about the heartland, which is true, but it's also true that the heartland is ignorant about the big cities.
Yeah.
I get funny letters from people in border areas who are upset about immigration. They say, how would you feel if New York City was full of immigrants?
That's a wondrul one. It's a completely wonderful one.
I also get people, by the way, saying, how would you feel if there were lots of foreigners competing for professor jobs? Once again, that's equally funny if you know anything about U.S. academia. So we're all a little bit ignorant, but I actually do find it kind of amazing that people can visit New York and still to believe, even people who've been here, I must be surrounded, as I sit here on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, I must be surrounded by a dystopian blasted landscape where people are afraid to go out their doors. And, there's a lot of America, which is not at all what you see. If you go to Manhattan and visit with intellectuals and cultural sophisticates, you're not getting a representative picture, just as visiting London is not giving me a very good picture of the UK.
Fine. Do you have, and of course, if you had, you could write a novel about it, a unifying conspiracy, a plot, a big plot that is being done that takes in Putin, every oligarch, Trump, all the mad people, the whole lot. It was animated by, I'm not going to say a Bond villain, but a foreign power.
Oh, no. I mean, it's not. Hidden conspiracies do exist, but mostly what we have is almost a kind of open conspiracy. I mean, there was a very distinct moment in the United States, which you're not telling me probably dates back to stuff that people learned in London. But there was a distinct moment in the circa 1970 when a bunch of rich guys said, enough with this social democratic state that we kind of have. We're going to build towards something which will allow the rich to get immensely richer and cut back on social benefits, and pursued a long-term campaign to that end, and set about trying to exploit racism, exploit, to a lesser extent, cultural nativism and religiosity in pursuit of that goal. And then at a certain point discovered that the people they thought they were using were actually using them. And guess what? It's the racists and the authoritarians who are in the driving seat, which happens every time. You were an oligarch who thought that Putin was your man, and at a certain point you discovered that you were his, and if you didn't like it, you were going to fall out of a window. That is the story, and it's not very hidden. you can't really do an expose on the way that big money helped buy us to where we are now, because it's out there in public records.
But you could have a long-term idea that it all starts with the Chinese. The Chinese back the Russians, who are a busted flush economically. They have territory, oil and gas. They're good at propaganda, medium good at fighting. That's it. It's not equipment for the modern world, but they can they can take the Russians back, hold the Russians back, rather, and the Russians can do all the messy stuff for them of dismantling the West.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm sure that there were, some Chinese who thought about it that way, and there's certainly Putin and company have thought about doing it, but I'm not sure that we need to invoke that kind of conspiracy. It looks to me as if the West is doing a pretty good job of taking itself apart without all of that outside aid.
Final question. What happened with the New York Times?
Okay. I had 24 years of a great deal of autonomy at the Times. I was barely edited. I was allowed to have a blog on the side. And in the last year, suddenly instead of a column coming back to me with a few minor style corrections and requests for fact checks, it would come back heavily edited, and then I have to spend hours trying to undo the damage. And all the outside outlets, the blog shrank to a once-a-week newsletter, and then they canceled the newsletter. So I was left feeling it wasn't my space anymore. By the way, I keep on saying to people, don't unsubscribe from the New York Times. We need Substack can't substitute for teams of reporters around the world. But as a place to do opinion writing, Mondays and Thursdays were column submission days, and I would go into each of those every day that I was submitting with the dread. What will they do to it? What will they do to what I wrote? And how hard will it be to repair the damage? And that was no way to live. So took my retirement, went off and started this new world of basically blogging, but as a newsletter. And as it turns out, that wasn't part of the plan, but also actually making a little money on the side is a much more comfortable place for me to be.
Well, we like it. That's all I can say. We like it. We the consumers like it very much. We used to feel very warm and wet about the New York Times. I still do in principle. Of course, when it was being run by a Brit, as you will recall. He's gone to CNN now, hasn't he?
Yeah, and by the way, CNN is still good. We'll see how long that lasts, but you can see that the Washington Post has been run into the ground,
absolutely,
and CBS News is being run into the ground. So we worry about these things. Funny, when people at the Times ask, who would you hire to replace you? And Catherine Rampell at the Washington Post was the obvious, and she's terrific, and she quit the Post. And she's now writing for Substack. So
yes.
There we are.
Well, if it all goes to the bad, there's a warm welcome for the New York intelligentsia in London. I can tell you that.
Oh,
I'm not saying there'll be well-paid jobs, but there'll be a warm welcome.
Well, I'm 72 years old, and we do not have lavish tastes, and so it's not about money. But look, the thought of I don't think it's going to happen, but all of us at some level have got our mental go bags packed. There's enough 1930s vibes that we do think about it. And of course, the UK has certain advantages, namely you speak a similar language. And but anyway.
We do. We try, and we relate very much to New York and to New Yorkers. Like, for instance, Michael Wolff. Do you know Michael Wolff?
I don't know him.
He's a lot of fun, and he likes us, which is a very good sign. And he has 100 hours of recorded conversations with Jeffrey Epstein.
Yes, well...
Kind of interesting, that.
The fact of the matter is that the U.S. government is shut in part because The Speaker of the House doesn't want to seat an elected congresswoman who would be the deciding vote in forcing a release of the Epstein files. If you put that in a novel, that would say, this is an implausible plot point, and yet that's where we are.
Yes, it's extraordinary. Almost, you could say, overexciting.
I'm friends with, I know, a lot of the best contemporary science fiction writers are based in Britain, largely in Edinburgh for some reason. But anyway,
yes,
some of them have complained that their dystopian near future novels, they can't write them anymore because the real dystopia is outpacing their imaginations. So here we are.
Here we are. Prof. Krugman, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you.
Huge thanks to Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize-winning economist. Now, next week we have Michael Crick, mature political journalist who spent decades sniffing out hypocrisy in Westminster's corridors, a founding member of Channel 4 News, long-time Newsnight correspondent, and author of One Party After Another, his sharp, grown-up biography of Nigel Farage. This podcast is presented by me, Peter York, and it's produced by Kate Dixon at Good Egg Productions. Do listen in again. Goodbye.